Spring 1943, an East Coast port in the United States, captured battle-hardened soldiers of Erwin Rommel's elite Afrika Korps marched toward the rail yard. In Europe, prisoners of war are routinely herded into squalid, freezing cattle cars. But here, the Germans are suddenly ushered into plush, upholstered Pullman sleeping cars. For years, Nazi propaganda had assured them that America was a starving, bankrupt wasteland on the verge of collapse. Yet, as the trains roll west, these enemy combatants find themselves sitting down to dining tables set with silver platters, thick steaks, fresh fruit, and real coffee. It is a surreal, disorienting reality that completely shatters their worldview and begs an immediate explanation. We are going to deconstruct this bizarre, fully documented journey of German prisoners across the American continent to understand the hidden mechanics of the United States home front. At the height of a global war of annihilation, while American troops were fighting and bleeding overseas, why did the government expend precious wartime resources to treat sworn enemy combatants like traveling VIPs? It is a question that reveals far more than a simple historical anomaly. By tracking the route of these Pullman rail cars from coastal ports to inland internment camps, we will uncover a deeply uncomfortable truth. This seemingly generous treatment accidentally exposed a dark domestic reality, highlighting a severe, systemic contradiction operating right beneath the surface of the nation's war machine. But to understand how and why this surreal scenario actually unfolded, we must first look at the massive, unprecedented logistical nightmare the War Department suddenly found itself facing in the middle of 1943. Setup. Context. Konflikt. The capitulation of Axis forces in Tunisia in May 1943 dumped an unprecedented problem into the lap of the Allied command. Nearly 275,000 German and Italian troops surrendered in North Africa. Great Britain, already rationing food and lacking secure holding space, could not possibly absorb them. The solution came down to sheer shipping capacity. The massive fleets of Liberty ships delivering American troops and supplies to the Mediterranean were returning to the United States largely empty. Using them as transatlantic transport for prisoners was a simple, efficient logistical equation. But once those ships hit American ports like New York, Boston, and Norfolk, the equation broke down. The East Coast was the vital, heavily congested artery of the American war effort. Keeping hundreds of thousands of highly trained enemy combatants near critical naval yards, ports, and munitions plants was viewed as an unacceptable security risk. They had to be moved inland immediately. Furthermore, the American interior was facing a severe wartime crisis of its own. With millions of able-bodied American men drafted into the armed forces, the agricultural sector was experiencing a crippling labor shortage. Crops were at risk of rotting in the fields across the Midwest and the South. The War Department devised a sweeping strategy to solve both problems simultaneously. Transport the captured Afrika Korps deep into the American interior, far from the vulnerable coasts, and put them to work harvesting crops and maintaining infrastructure. Executing this mass migration, however, meant tapping directly into the nation's commercial railway network. Here, the United States military found itself bound by a rigid, non-negotiable legal framework. The War Department operated under strict adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Article 11 of that treaty explicitly mandated that the food ration of prisoners must be equal in quantity and quality to that of troops at base camps of the detaining power. Housing and transport standards carried similar stipulations. The Office of the Provost Marshal General, tasked with overseeing the entire POW program, enforced this compliance with militant precision. They operated under the terrifying assumption that any deviation, any rumored mistreatment of German prisoners in America would invite immediate, brutal retaliation against American troops held captive in Nazi Germany. Consequently, the War Department issued standing orders that German prisoners were to be transported under the exact same conditions as American servicemen traveling within the United States. In 1943, moving troops long distances meant utilizing commercial passenger rail lines, specifically Pullman sleeping and dining cars. The government commandeered large segments of this commercial rail fleet to execute the inland transfers. But the American railway system was not just a network of steel and steam. It was a complex social engine heavily dependent on a specific workforce. The service staff on these passenger trains, the legendary Pullman porters and dining car waiters, were almost exclusively black men. This reliance on the existing commercial rail infrastructure engineered an explosive, though entirely bureaucratic, collision. To move the prisoners to the rural agricultural camps in the South and Southwest, the transport trains had to route directly through the heart of Jim Crow America. In these states, strict legal segregation dictated every aspect of public life. It enforced a brutal racial hierarchy that demanded black Americans, including black soldiers in United States military uniform, be treated as second-class citizens, routinely barred from white waiting rooms, standard dining cars, and regular passenger compartments. Yet, the War Department's uncompromising interpretation of international law mandated that the white German prisoners receive standard military treatment, which equated to first-class commercial service. The logistics dictated the method of transport, the international treaty dictated the high standard of care, and domestic law dictated the racial caste of the environment they were traveling through. The military bureaucracy had inadvertently created a volatile traveling paradox, a system where enemy soldiers dedicated to the destruction of the United States were legally required to be accommodated with comfort and respect, while the black American railway workers operating the trains faced systemic degradation. This rigid bureaucratic mandate, forged in Geneva and applied directly to the segregated tracks of the American South, set the stage for a psychological shock the German prisoners never saw coming. The shock did not begin in an interrogation room. It began the moment the trains pulled away from the East Coast ports and the men of the Afrika Korps looked out the windows of their Pullman cars. For years, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine had indoctrinated the German military with a very specific image of the United States. To these soldiers, America was a culturally bankrupt nation teetering on the edge of economic collapse. They had been assured that U-boat wolf packs in the Atlantic had starved the country of raw materials, and that the American home front was crippled by severe rationing, poverty, and industrial decay. But as the trains rolled westward through states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, the passing landscape offered a devastating, undeniable rebuttal. Through the wide glass windows, the prisoners saw no signs of a society on its knees. Instead of the strict blackouts and bombed-out infrastructure they were accustomed to in Europe, they passed untouched, neon-lit cities blazing with electricity, a civilian luxury long abandoned in the Third Reich. The true psychological blow, however, came from the sheer scale of the nation's manufacturing power. The passenger trains routed past colossal steel mills and massive factories that stretched for miles. These plants were not just functioning, they were operating at a fever pitch, running 24 hours a day under glaring floodlights. The prisoners saw sprawling rail yards choked with thousands of freight cars moving endless supplies of coal, oil, and steel without interruption. As the industrial centers gave way to the Midwest, the German troops witnessed vast, highly mechanized farms spanning to the horizon, utilizing heavy tractors and modern harvesters, a stark contrast to the horse-drawn supply lines the Wehrmacht still heavily relied upon. For the captured German officer corps, this rolling panorama was more devastating than a tactical defeat on the battlefield. It was a terrifying mathematical revelation. Sitting in their comfortable upholstered seats, watching this endless conveyor belt of American logistics, the ideological foundation of their war effort quietly cracked. They realized they were fighting an industrial monster they could never hope to outproduce. Their deeply ingrained worldview was systematically crushed by the physical evidence of absolute material supremacy. But the overwhelming abundance rushing past the train windows was only half the story. Inside the passenger cars, navigating the narrow aisles between the plush seats and the silver dining tables, a very different social hierarchy was at play. The reality inside the passenger cars was just as disorienting as the industrial landscape rushing past the windows. For the captured veterans of the Afrika Korps, the environment of the Pullman sleeping cars was something out of a forgotten pre-war dream. These were men who had spent the last 2 years fighting in the brutal, abrasive conditions of the North African desert, surviving on severely rationed tinned meat, stale bread, and strictly measured canteens of tepid water. Now, they found themselves sinking into deeply upholstered seats, surrounded by polished mahogany and crisp white linens. As the transport trains reached cruising speed, the dining car service commenced, delivering a psychological blow that no artillery barrage could match. The prisoners were presented with printed menus. Waiters carrying heavy silver platters served them freshly fried chicken, thick cuts of roast beef, mountains of mashed potatoes, and bowls of fresh fruit. They were given unlimited access to white sugar, real butter, and freshly brewed coffee, luxuries that had virtually disappeared from the European continent. At first, the German officer corps was deeply suspicious. Documented post-war diaries and intercepted letters reveal that many prisoners initially believed the lavish treatment was a sophisticated psychological operation. They assumed it was a temporary propaganda stunt, a brief display of fake abundance designed to soften them up before brutal interrogations or before transferring them to the squalid conditions they fully expected. But as the trains rolled on for a second day, and then a third, the meals kept arriving. The portions never shrank, the coffee was never watered down. The sheer, relentless, logistical weight of this calorie distribution began to erode their martial pride. The prisoners began to calculate the staggering cost of feeding hundreds of thousands of enemy combatants at such a high standard, while simultaneously fighting a two-front global war. The luxury was not a trick. It was simply the baseline operational standard of the American supply chain. This realization triggered a profound ideological collapse. As they sat in the dining cars, lighting complimentary American cigarettes, the prisoners quietly acknowledged to one another that a nation capable of effortlessly squandering such resources on its prisoners could never be defeated by the overextended, resource-starved Wehrmacht. But the overwhelming volume of calories was secondary to the profound shock of exactly who was delivering them. Navigating the narrow aisles between the sleeper berths and the dining tables were the legendary Pullman porters and dining car waitstaff. These service crews were almost exclusively comprised of Black American men. For the German soldiers, this presented an immediate and intense cognitive dissonance. For a decade, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, along with the racial theorists of the Third Reich, had saturated the German military with a highly specific, viciously racist doctrine. The Nazi ideological matrix defined Africans and their descendants as biologically inferior, subhuman, and completely incapable of civilized organization, discipline, or professional competence. They had been taught that America was racially degenerate, polluted by a diverse population that would crumble under the pressure of war. Yet, the reality standing in front of them completely short-circuited this indoctrination. The Black Pullman porters wore immaculate, heavily starched white coats and crisp uniforms. They moved with a strict, practiced efficiency, executing a complex logistical ballet of converting passenger seats into sleeping berths, managing vast amounts of luggage, and coordinating hundreds of meal services on a moving train. They spoke with articulate precision, carrying themselves with a dignified, unyielding professionalism. They addressed the captive German officers as "Sir," not out of genuine subservience, but out of strict adherence to corporate service protocols. The German prisoners did not know how to process this. Primary sources show a fractured response. Some prisoners clung desperately to their arrogance, attempting to bark orders and demand service, as if their status as the supposed Aryan master race superseded their status as defeated captives. But many others were intensely observant, quietly recording in their diaries their deep confusion over the dignified bearing and high operational competence of the black railway workers. The racist caricatures printed in Nazi publications like Der Stürmer simply did not align with the highly disciplined men running the train cars with quiet authority. This surreal interaction, however, was not some progressive American social experiment designed to re-educate the Nazis. It was a rigidly enforced corporate and military procedure, held together by a fragile alliance of convenience, the threat of court-martial, and the strict parameters of civilian business contracts. The transport trains were essentially a moving jurisdiction, a shared space between the United States War Department and the civilian railroad corporations. The American military guards assigned to the trains, usually young military police officers, were vastly outnumbered by the battle-hardened Afrika Korps veterans. The Guards' primary objective was not social engineering. It was maintaining absolute order, preventing escapes, and delivering the human cargo to the inland camps on schedule. To achieve this, the military relied heavily on the established, rigid structure of the commercial train schedule to keep the prisoners docile and occupied. Meanwhile, the civilian railway executives and train conductors had a completely different set of priorities. They were tasked with keeping the massive domestic logistical chain moving without violating powerful railway union contracts or compromising the Pullman Company's famous service standards. Because the War Department, heavily pressured by the Provost Marshal General to adhere to the Geneva Convention, had paid for first-class commercial transport, the Pullman Company was legally obligated to provide first-class commercial service. This created a bizarre, inflexible legal framework. The black porters were bound by their employment contracts and company regulations to serve the passengers with the exact same deference and high standard of care they would offer civilian businessmen, Hollywood executives, or American politicians. It did not legally matter that the passengers were currently sworn enemies of the United States. The American military guards enforced this bizarre social hierarchy to the letter. If a German prisoner requested a second cup of coffee, the international treaty dictated he was entitled to it. The civilian contract dictated the method of delivery, and the black porter was ordered to pour it. The military bureaucracy cared only about strict compliance. They operated in constant fear that any perceived mistreatment, any operational friction, or any failure to provide the mandated standard of living would be reported back to Berlin by the Red Cross, potentially resulting in immediate, brutal retaliation against American pilots and soldiers languishing in German Stalag camps. Consequently, the illusion of high-class transit had to be maintained at all costs. But maintaining this frictionless, luxurious illusion required a grinding, largely invisible human engine. As the German prisoners slowly accepted their defeat and settled into the comfortable realization that they would likely survive the war in total safety, the black railway workers were enduring a grueling, exhausting reality. The labor required to make this transport possible was staggering. Pullman porters during the war frequently worked relentless, physically punishing shifts, sometimes logging up to 400 hours a month. They suffered from chronic sleep deprivation, catching only a few hours of rest on fold-out cots hidden in the smoking compartments or the narrow corridors of the dining cars. They were absolutely instrumental to the American war effort, keeping the vital arteries of domestic logistics flowing smoothly under immense pressure. Yet, they were forced to perform highly subservient roles for men who had fought to expand a fascist regime that would have systematically exterminated them. The black porters and waiters were acutely aware of the bitter, crushing irony of their situation. They were wearing the uniform of the Pullman Company, sacrificing their health to serve the pampered enemies of the United States, while their own sons, brothers, and neighbors were being drafted into a strictly segregated American military, often relegated to menial labor battalions and denied the right to fight in combat roles. As the journey progressed, a dark realization began to dawn on both the captives and the captive workforce. The German prisoners, despite having been shot at by American forces just weeks prior, despite having killed Allied soldiers, and despite being stripped of their weapons and their freedom, inadvertently occupied a higher social rung on the train than the black Americans employed to serve them. The prisoners slowly realized that their white skin, even wrapped in the uniform of the Third Reich, commanded a perverse level of respect and legal protection within the framework of American civilian contracts and military compliance. The black workers, possessing American citizenship and contributing directly to the defense of the nation, were legally bound to defer to them. This underlying tension, the fragile, highly combustible coexistence of international military law, corporate railway logistics, and the deeply entrenched American racial caste system was carefully managed by the military guards. It was a theoretical paradox that could only be contained as long as the trains remained in motion, isolated within the steel walls of the Pullman cars. But the trains could not stay in motion forever. As the locomotives pushed out of the industrial Midwest, they began their descent into the rural agricultural zones where the POW camps were being rapidly constructed. To reach these destinations, the transports had to cross the invisible but rigidly enforced cultural borders of the nation. The trains routed directly into the Jim Crow South, an environment where state laws demanded total racial separation and where the uniform of the United States military offered black citizens no protection whatsoever. This simmering, unspoken tension finally boiled over into a documented, undeniable historical reality when the train made a scheduled logistical stop at a civilian station. The locomotive's brakes screamed as the transport train ground to a halt at a major civilian transit hub deep in the American South. The military guards faced an immediate logistical bottleneck. The dining cars needed to be restocked, and the hundreds of prisoners still had to be fed. To maintain the strict timeline mandated by the Geneva Convention, the American military police marched the Afrika Korps veterans out of the rail cars and directly toward the station's main civilian restaurant. At that exact moment, the harsh reality of domestic law collided violently with the uniform of the United States Army. A detachment of black American soldiers, carrying heavy duffel bags and dressed in regulation khaki, was transiting through the same station on their way to combat training. Exhausted and hungry, these American GIs approached the front doors of the dining room to buy a meal. They were immediately and strictly denied entry. The local restaurant management, enforcing the ironclad segregation laws of the Jim Crow South, barred the black soldiers from stepping foot inside. The fact that they were sworn to defend the country meant absolutely nothing to the local authorities. They were peremptorily ordered to go around to a cramped, segregated counter in the back alley. Simultaneously, the front doors were held wide open for the enemy. The German prisoners, men who had literally been firing machine guns at American forces in North Africa just weeks prior, were escorted directly past the stranded American GIs. Because the captured soldiers of the Third Reich were white, local ordinances deemed them acceptable patrons. They were ushered into the spacious dining room and comfortably seated at the main tables alongside their white American guards. The black soldiers were left standing outside, staring through the glass at the fascists they had been drafted to fight, who were now being served with dignity and respect. What happened next during that meal service would permanently shatter any simplified, heroic narrative of the good war. Inside the station's main dining room, the surreal theater of wartime compliance played out in agonizing detail. Black civilian waitstaff were ordered by local management to meticulously serve the German prisoners. Heavy ceramic plates piled high with hot food were placed in front of men still wearing the faded tunics of the Afrika Korps. For the German officers, the service itself was not the shock. It was the stark, undeniable contrast visible right through the restaurant windows. Out on the platform, clustered near the kitchen's back door, the black American GIs were handed cold rations wrapped in paper. Men who had just sworn an oath to defend the United States, who were deploying to fight the Axis powers, were forced to eat standing up in the exhaust fumes of the rail yard. Sitting at their neatly set tables, the German prisoners watched this dynamic unfold. Surviving letters sent back to Germany and post-war testimonies reveal exactly how the captive soldiers processed this moment. They were deeply unsettled by the rigid social mechanics operating right in front of them. For years, they had been subjected to relentless Nazi propaganda, insisting that absolute racial hierarchies were the foundation of a functioning state. Now, sitting deep in the American South, they saw the most extreme moral contradiction of the Allied war effort laid completely bare in a single room. The prisoners slowly realized the dark calculus of the environment they had entered. Their white skin, even when wrapped in the uniform of a fascist enemy dedicated to the destruction of American democracy, commanded a higher social status, better treatment, and more institutional respect than the uniform of a black American soldier fighting for his own country. The sworn enemy combatant was being served with dignity, while the Allied citizen was subjected to systemic degradation. It was an ideological paradox that no military manual or international treaty could reconcile. When the meal finally concluded, the military police ordered the prisoners up from their tables. The German veterans were escorted out of the restaurant, past the segregated back alley, and back into the comfortable confines of their Pullman sleeping cars. As the locomotive whistle blew and the transports pulled away from the station, the trains carried this dark, quiet realization with them, rolling steadily onward toward the barbed wire enclosures waiting in the American Midwest. When the Pullman cars finally reached the sprawling, newly constructed internment camps of the American interior, the silver platters and crisp linens were replaced by barbed wire and wooden barracks. The surreal journey was over. The mystery that began on the East Coast docks was finally resolved. The luxurious transport of the Afrika Korps was never an act of American benevolence or a sophisticated psychological operation. It was the cold, mechanical byproduct of a massive bureaucracy. The rigid mandates of the Geneva Convention colliding directly with commercial railway contracts and the deeply entrenched racial laws of the Jim Crow South. This bizarre episode goes far beyond a quirky historical footnote. It exposes how the Second World War was actually managed through the ruthless application of logistics, resources, and domestic social structures. The journey proved that the United States possessed an unstoppable industrial supremacy. The sheer, relentless abundance witnessed from the passenger cars shattered the ideological morale of the German officer corps, proving they were fighting a titan that could effortlessly feed its sworn enemies better than the Third Reich could feed its own frontline troops. Yet, that absolute material victory carried a lingering shadow. The same logistical machine that projected immense power abroad was severely compromised by its own internal failures at home. America built the arsenal to crush fascism in Europe, but the domestic infrastructure that treated fascist prisoners with legally mandated dignity simultaneously humiliated the Black American citizens who operated the trains and wore the nation's military uniform. It was a stark, glaring contradiction, operating right at the heart of the arsenal of democracy, bringing us to the final, unavoidable truth of the journey. The ultimate cultural shock for these captured veterans of the Afrika Korps was not simply surviving the overwhelming, mechanized wrath of the United States military. The true psychological revelation happened quietly on domestic soil, served on a silver platter inside a commandeered passenger car. They discovered that within the very borders of the arsenal of democracy, an undeniable racial hierarchy dictated the terms of basic human dignity, proving that whiteness ultimately mattered far more than which side of the global war a man was actually fighting on.